Hey everybody, you are not going to believe this, but today I actually have an episode of my American Presidential Reading Challenge Supplemental that is actually about books on presidents. When I originally started this feature, it was because I was reading supplemental books on presidents outside of my one biography on every single American president. And then over the years that I've done this now, I've just gone so far afield that sometimes when I actually read books on presidents, it feels really surprising. But I actually have 5 books that are president or at least presidential adjacent to tell you about. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of good ones, but I read them. I did it. I have not been reading a ton, even less nonfiction. So I did it. And that's what we can be happy about right now. So these are in no particular order outside of the order in which I read them. And so I'm going to start with The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968 by Luke Nichter. Now, I have read another book about the 1968 election by Lawrence O'Donnell called Playing with Fire. And that is still top 5, like not just like books about this particular election, but like books about elections. It was so well written, it was so like engaging and interesting. And so every single time I read a different book about this election, it has a high bar to catch up to. And so this is an election where there is a lot going on. You've got LBJ in the mix, you've got Richard Nixon in the mix, Vietnam is kind of like circling around in the background. And there is a lot of stories in this election of, you know, Richard Nixon telling the Vietnamese not to sign a peace treaty with the LBJ administration because he's going to come in. LBJ eventually drops out. Hubert Humphrey takes his place. So it's like, it's messy. This is a very, very messy election with a lot of moving parts, and trying to capture it all in one book can be very difficult. One of the pluses of this book was that it does focus a lot more on the personal relationship between LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. It focused more on the fact that they were like in communication on phone calls. Like, you know, LBJ really felt, especially even once he was out of the race, and like, you know, he's got Hubert Humphrey kind of like coming up behind him. Because there's such a volatile situation going on, he is really keeping both of them kind of like abreast of what's going on in Vietnam and trying to communicate. And what a lot of people don't know is that LBJ also recorded his calls. So we have some of that actually recorded that we can use as like evidence for some of that relationship. Otherwise, though, there wasn't a lot like new or super interesting in this book that was any better written than Playing with Fire. And honestly, I had a lot of like a hard time with this audiobook because I listened to all of my nonfiction on audio. Someone did not tell this audiobook narrator how to pronounce the last names of certain big players in these administrations, and he was like mispronouncing what to me are like fairly common like famous names. Again, I've read a lot particularly about Nixon, so like maybe they're not as common to other people, but there were so many of them that were pronounced wrong, and someone needed to help this audiobook narrator because it's the whole book and it's so bad. So anyway, I still recommend, if you're going to read one book about this election, to read Playing with Fire by Lawrence O'Donnell. But if you are more interested in that personal relationship style, maybe this is one you'd like to pick up. So the next book that I want to talk about covers some stories from multiple presidential administrations, and that is The Situation Room, The Inside Story of Presidents in Crisis by George Stephanopoulos and also Lisa Dickey. This is a situation where obviously George Stephanopoulos is the like big name on the cover, but it looks like Lisa Dickey helped him write this book, so I want to give credit to her. So again, this is one of those books where basically every chapter is a new story about some sort of situation that happened in the Situation Room. something that was interesting about this book is that it's fairly well written, even though you're essentially meeting a brand new cast of characters every single chapter as we jump around through presidential administrations. It's fairly concise, it's easy to follow. I didn't really feel lost in any of the chapters. Some of them might be more familiar. For example, there's the story about the Obama administration and the Bin Laden raid, for example. And some of them were maybe less known, at least to me, if they maybe either haven't happened in my lifetime or just like probably didn't have the prominence of that type of situation. But it covers a lot of the, if not most of the more recent presidential administrations that have had something going on, and talking about the different players in the room, the different ways they made decisions, and also like, you know, depending sometimes on the presidential administration, like what they're, I don't want to say what they found important in making those decisions, but like obviously depending on how you consider the, you know, your relationship with the country that something is happening with, or the person, or like how serious it is, like obviously like, you know, Bin Laden was like enemy number one, right? And we needed to go get him, and that was really serious. But also all of the time when these things are happening, there are world political consequences. And like I said, I really appreciated how easy this book was to read despite covering all of these different things. I wouldn't say, like I said, that I learned a ton from it, but if you are looking for an interesting book about the ways that many different presidential administrations made decisions in these really, really tense and important moments, something that doesn't, like I said, every single chapter is basically like a short story, right? So you can kind of take it in pieces. Like I said, I don't know that I necessarily learned too much that was new, but it was interesting, it was enjoyable, and it was easy to read. So, as a book that is president adjacent, we have American Woman, The Transformation of the Modern First Lady from Hillary Clinton to Jill Biden by Katie Rogers. Now, I feel like this title is slightly misleading. This book, while the title may suggest that like it might be a little bit like, honestly, The Situation Room, right? Where we start at Hillary Clinton and we kind of like move forward in time. It does a little bit of that, but really this book is focalized around Jill Biden and how she is very different from a lot of the first ladies that have come before her, but also how some of the things that she was allowed to do when she was first lady, such as keep her job, are things that were not allowed even to people like Hillary Clinton, or, you know, she was vilified for doing certain things, and how, you know, Jill Biden may have learned from her. And obviously in between you also have, you know, the Laura Bush, you have Michelle Obama, you have Melania. So, you know, there are some different stories in there, but again, Katie Rogers clearly had, like, she has interviews with Jill in this book and more access with Jill than anyone else that is covered in this. So suggesting that she's not the focus of this book, as the title I feel does feel a little bit misleading. I also do feel that this book was a victim a little bit of the timeline, which is that this book was obviously written during the first Biden administration, but before it was kind of really clear that he was going to drop out. And so by the time this is published, and for the most part, he's basically already dropped out of the race. So there are some things in the book that talk about, you know, her plans for the future, or what she wants. And so it just already felt a little bit dated and weird. And that is, again, the really, I don't say problem, but like if you are writing about political figures who are currently out there doing things in the world, this is often what happens, and why I don't read a lot of contemporary event stuff, because the analysis that's in there, the conclusions that they draw, by the time that book is published, since it usually takes, you know, however long it takes to write the book, and then to get that book out there and published, you know, you're talking at least a year probably. Like, events move and they change, and sentences that seemed normal in the draft of the book, by the time it's published, are weird because events have changed. And so, yeah, I wanted to like this book way more than I actually did, because it was, like I said, misleading. I thought we would get way more on other first ladies besides Jill, rather than all of those stories kind of rotating around Jill. And like I said, events on the ground were very different by the time this book was published. And so a lot of like I said, the concluding chapters or thoughts, they just hit funny. Don't worry, the next book was even worse. So I also read The Rise of Andrew Jackson, Myth, Manipulation, and the Making of Modern Politics by David Stephen Heidler. I was quite interested in this book because it's recently come out, and there are a lot of still really impactful things that happened from the election of Andrew Jackson that do really still have a huge impact on our current political system. You know, prior to Andrew Jackson, it was more of like, you know, the elite members of the politic kind of like picking the successor, even though it was supposed to be more of a popular vote. That's not really what was happening. And so Andrew Jackson runs for president, kind of loses within the system to John Quincy Adams, gets real big mad about it, and then comes back 4 years later and really turns the system into something more focused on party politics, city party politics, and popular vote through the efforts of Martin Van Buren. However, what I found as I was reading this book is that it was more of like a description of the steps that the Andrew Jackson campaign took to get him elected, a lot of which not done by Andrew Jackson himself, but that's normal of the time. It used to be considered extremely gauche for the actual candidate to participate in the campaigning. So he wasn't involved in a lot of it. There was a lot of kind of like dirty like tricks and talk about Andrew Jackson, his wife. There's a whole thing with their marriage, and she actually dies before he takes office, and he has a huge chip on his shoulder about this because he believes that the news coverage and news cycle is like part of the reason that she has died, because they were so mean to her. But what I found really odd, besides the fact that it was just like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Again, that title is suggesting that there's going to be some larger connection to modern politics. And predominantly what came through in the book was they were trying to make a connection between the way political spin worked for Andrew Jackson and the way political spin works now, the way that party politics and people like manipulate news stories, something like that. But what's weird is that in the events they're describing, the Jackson campaign is able to do that a lot because news traveled so slowly. You could have a story exist in one town, let alone one state, and that story could be completely different in a different town, a different state, and they would very likely not be talking to each other because communication is so slow. And so you're able to kind of like manipulate the way that you want to tell a story based on like that separation between towns and people and places. Whereas today, it is similar in the fact that we are often siloed, like we get our news from people that usually agree with us, or at least like lean the way that we do, right? We could do the whole thing about the difference between like Fox News, CNN, MS Now, whatever the heck that is now, whatever. But the bigger issue now today is that we are so hyper connected. It would be almost impossible for the things they were talking about in Jackson's time to happen now, or at the very least they would need to happen in very, very different and distinct ways, because the technology, the makeup of the country, like it has all changed so much. So not only was the book boring, its main thesis did not make sense to me because I did not believe in the argument. So do I believe that there is a lot to be learned about how our current system operates from the Jacksonian era? Yes. Do I like him and want to read a lot about this administration? No. But I gave it a good try with this one and I was not impressed. So if you are looking for something that will actually tell you about what this book's title says it will be about, look elsewhere. And finally, I would like to tell you about a book that technically I have already told you about. So I haven't made one of these videos in a while, but I had read this book before I made a video that I released last year called Read to Resist, which I will link up above. And this was one of the books that I included in my comfort reading category. Do with that what you will. The book in question is The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It by Corey Brettschneider. What I really appreciated about this book is obviously it's another kind of like survey book, right? Where there are 5 different presidents that are the focus of these 5 different sections of the book. But these presidents are not presented as the savior, anything like that. They are actually people working against the rights and privileges of the American people. So for example, you have John Adams, who during his administration passed a bunch of laws and stuff that basically really, really limited freedom of the press. This was, of course, antithetical to the thing we had literally just fought a war about. And so there was a movement within the newly American people to say, actually, no. And this was almost even more revolutionary than the revolution itself at the time, because again, John Adams is only our 2nd president. We are still a wobbly-kneed baby nation trying to figure out how we're going to rule. George Washington, in his 2nd administration, is more contentious, but his 1st administration, people were like, oh, it's Washington. And there wasn't as much totally as much dissent. Again, 2nd administration, we're doing broad strokes of history here. But again, so this was a really, really big moment for the American people to either be okay, we don't like this, and we're just gonna sit back and kind of let it happen, or we don't like this, and the entire point of this nation is supposed to be that we have a say, and so we're gonna say something. And so that's one of the stories that's in there. Also, there's a chapter or a section on Woodrow Wilson, who I have learned through this process that I do not like at all. So that was really great. But again, I think it was more of I didn't learn new historical facts necessarily, because I knew all these things had happened, but it was really uplifting in certain ways to see how there have been other presidents who have done things that we as the American people collectively don't like, because they infringe upon our rights and our liberties that we are promised in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And so reading this and seeing how throughout our history, like I said, that first part, that's John Adams, he's president number 2, and then moving on into more recent times, feeling okay, we have the history, we have the playbook, and we can look backwards to these other movements that have been successful and how they did it, and then move that forward into our own time and say, listen, we have rights and we have privileges that we believe are being infringed upon, and we're not going to let it happen, because this is hardly the first time that this has happened in our nation. It will not be the last. And, we have a Bill of Rights that says free speech, a whole bunch of other stuff, that, we agreed on and we agreed to build on. And we can do that, and we have done that. I kicked my camera stand there, I apologize. But if there are any of the books in this set that you might be interested in, Presidents and the People is definitely my favorite one, because it is more of that survey style book that jumps around between administrations. It is easier to read in pieces. It doesn't go super deep. It's definitely not dry. It's very engaging. And I really enjoyed it, because I really liked seeing, again, that string of history, these movements building off of each other and taking inspiration from each other, and having a book on presidential history that's not being the president is the center of the world, but rather the president is the president, and then there's all of us. So I definitely really, really enjoyed that book. I probably described it a little bit better also in my Read to Resist video, which I will have linked above. And you can check out my other recommendations there. But yeah, I'm glad to have finally included it in a video where it belongs. I don't know when I'll make another one of these, because I have significantly slowed down my nonfiction reading. I have actually put away a couple of books towards the original challenge, which was to, again, read one book on every single American president. However, when I started this, we were several presidents ago. So I really need to potentially wrap up some of those. I have presidents left over like Franklin Pierce that it's really, really hard to find anything about that I might want to read that's not like dusty and dry. But I'm going to do my best to hopefully make a push on that as well, because I do miss reading this type of nonfiction. I just really haven't had the brain space for it. So I don't know when I'll be back with another one of these. You'll probably see me again with more romance, but thank you guys for watching. Feel free to watch any of the videos that are back in the catalog, because I've read some really, really excellent books I would love for other people to read. And hopefully sooner rather than later, I'll be back with some more. Thanks guys. Bye.